welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the book launch for Muggins by Grant Hayter-Menzies. And I'm Monica. I'm from Heritage House Publishing. And I'm just going to do some quick introductions and then hand it off to the gentleman of the hour. So Heritage House Publishing focuses on historical, social, political, and recreational subjects. We publish books for both adults and young readers, guidebooks, and the Amazing Stories series. If you want to keep in touch with us, follow us on social media. We've also got a newsletter. All those links are at heritagehouse.ca. So our book launch for Muggins tonight, although it's virtual and we may be joining you from wherever you are in the world, it does take place on the land of Indigenous peoples. And so I'd like to recognize that Heritage House Publishing is located within the traditional territories of the Lekwungen, including the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, Malahat, Pacheedaht, Chinnu, Suk, and Wasainik peoples. And if you know what territory you're joining us from, or maybe you're somewhere else in the world other than Canada, let us know in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Speaking of the chat, if you're watching this live, you can ask questions. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, just put it in the chat function and we'll see the questions come up. And hopefully Grant will have time to get to all of those. So this is being recorded, so you'll have a chance to watch it again and again, or send it to someone who missed it. The link will be the same on YouTube. The book, if you need to get your copy still, you can get signed copies from Tanner's Books in Sydney. And you can also request personalization if you want Grant to make it out to someone special. Or if maybe you're thinking about holiday gifts already, this would make a great choice and you can get the author to personalize it. So enough from me. I'd like to hand it over to our host this evening. Cliff McNeil-Smith is the owner of Tanner's Books in Sydney, BC, and he's going to be chatting with Grant and taking it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Monica, and congratulations to Heritage House for publishing Grant's latest work. And hello to everyone in our virtual audience. It's a pleasure to have you join us this evening. And of course, we all look forward to the time, hopefully sooner than later, that we can get together in person to do events like this. I'd like to just take a few moments to outline how our virtual event will go this evening. We'll try to keep it under an hour, so to about 6:50 or 6:55 or 7:55. I'll in a moment introduce Grant, and he will introduce how the book came about and do selected readings for about 10 minutes. We'll then open it up to question and answers. As Monica indicated, you have an opportunity to post your questions. And then Grant has a special video clip he would like to show us this evening, and we'll cue that and turn it back over to Grant. Maybe take a few more questions, and then Grant has some of the photographs from the book that he'd like to speak to as well, and that will be interesting. We may, depending on how Q&A goes, we may have another brief reading from Grant, or let you know again how you can get a personalized copy of Muggins from Tanner's Books. So with that, I'll introduce, give an introduction to Grant. For over a decade, Grant Hayter-Menzies has specialized in biographies of extraordinary women, publishing the first full-length lives of stage and screen stars Charlotte Greenwood and Billy Burke. Also published a biography of Chinese-American author Princess Derling. He did a book on the diarist Sarah Pike Conger, the wife of the American ambassador to China and a friend to the controversial Empress Dowager of China. He then did a work on Pauline Benton, the American-born master of Chinese shadow theater, and Lillian Carter, mother of President Jimmy Carter. In 2015, Grant published a biography of Rags, the mascot terrier of the 1st Division in France during World War I. He then did a biography of Dorothy Brooke, the Englishwoman who in 1930 in Cairo, Egypt, discovered and saved thousands of elderly and abused war horses, mules, and donkeys that were abandoned by British forces at the termination of World War I, and that was published in the US and the UK in 2017-18. His biography of Wu, the Javanese monkey companion of Canadian artist and writer Emily Carr, was published in March 2019 by Douglas and McIntyre. And the book North, Echoes of Slavery in a New England Family, is Grant's memoir of his discovering his ancestral legacy over 3 centuries of slavery, was published in the spring of 2018. He's contributed to numerous collections and anthologies. He's also the literary executor of playwright William Luce, who lived from 1931 to 2019, and was the award-winning author of The Belle of Amherst. Grant lives in Sydney, sunny Sydney by the sea, and here in BC with his dog Freddie and partner Rudy. And Grant, welcome this evening, and we look forward to the introduction of the book and your reading.
Thank you, Cliff. It's especially meaningful to have you a part of this because had I not been sitting in your bookstore back in, 2014, 2015, I would not have even heard about Muggins and would probably not have written this book. So what I will do with that in mind, I will read a portion of it, the first chapter of the book, which describes this encounter. The first time I've ever begun a book in a bookstore that took, 5 years to achieve, to come to fruition. So here goes. I first heard of Muggins, the famous and, to me then, utterly unknown fundraising dog of Great War Victoria, on Remembrance Day in 2015, close to 95 years after his death. The setting was Tanner's Books in Sydney, a community north of Victoria on the Saanich Peninsula, which was then my hometown with my then partner and our rescue dog, a Spitz called Freddie, who was still very much part of my life. That day, I was signing copies of my newly released biography of Rags, the Paris stray who became a mascot to the American 1st Division in 1918, saving hundreds of lives running messages through cratered battlefields, as well as saving the spirits and the sanity of soldiers who, but for this little dog, did not have a whole lot to look forward to from day to day in the depths of warfare and bloodshed. I did more than sit there signing books. People had approached me that afternoon with emotion in their faces, having been touched by the book's cover, showing Rags with one of the soldiers who'd rescued him off the streets of Paris in July 1918, or who were moved by the day's memories to explore further. One woman was different. Wearing all black, she came up to me with a smile, looked at my book with its cover photo of Rags and a soldier, put it down, and began to weep. I hurried around the table to comfort her. She told me through tears that her son was in the Canadian Forces and had to leave his beloved dog behind in Alberta. His subsequent efforts to get posted as near to home as possible and near to the dog had failed. She wanted to buy a copy of my book for her son to help him get through his posting. I wrote something special in the book for her son, and then off she went, and then that's when I met Dr. Sylvia Van Kirk. A retired University of Toronto professor, in 1980, Sylvia published Many Tender Ties, Women in Fur Trade Society, 1670 to 1870, an important work tracing interdependencies, not just between colonial trappers and Indigenous peoples in Canada, but the ties of relationships between Indigenous women and those men. It was as if I should be walking up to her book signing table, not the other way around, and I rose to greet her. We chatted about my book. She had a copy she wanted me to sign. While I was writing on the flyleaf, Sylvia said, "Have you ever heard of Muggins?" By that Remembrance Day afternoon in 2015, I had lived and worked in Greater Victoria for almost 10 years, but no, I had not heard of Muggins. Who or what was he? Sylvia chuckled somewhat grimly. Obviously, she had faced this response before. Muggins, she told me, was a Spitz dog who lived in Victoria. He was snow white in color and had raised thousands of dollars between 1916 and his death in early 1920 for wartime charities, notably the Red Cross, of which he was an unofficial, much-beloved mascot, pretty much like Rags still is to the First Division. I've been collecting material on Muggins for years, Sylvia finished as she pulled away. He deserves a book, I think. I'd enjoy working on a project about Muggins with you, she added, thanking me for the inscription. Before she departed, Sylvia and I had exchanged email addresses, and I'd planned to get in touch with her, though not, I admit, because I much looked forward to being a co-author. I had tried this before, and it had never worked out for either myself or my co-conspirator. For me, writing is an intensely personal solo act, motivated by the need to learn as much as I can and to share what I've learned on a subject that I start out knowing mostly nothing about. I write because I am taken up by an idea that makes me lose sleep at night, dream through my days, sends me on wild goose chases through stacks of other writers' books to find one fact for all my chasing, pushes me to arrange 11th hour interviews with historic witnesses fading fast into old age. But before any decision could be made one way or the other, and not long after that book signing in Sydney, my life shape-shifted in almost every conceivable way. I was confronted with several upheavals in succession: the death of one parent and a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease for another, a divorce followed by a house sale and a move, a job change, and all the other adjustments and readjustments required by circumstances largely beyond our control. Eventually, as it does, life settled into a new, if not quite familiar pattern, and I began to think again of Muggins. Even as I worked on 2 more books, Muggins kept bobbing up, brought to mind when my own dog, Freddie, dark where Muggins was light, came up to my desk to gaze at me with his warm brown eyes, so like Muggins in the photos Sylvia had shared with me, radiating a keen sense of needing to be of service to whatever I needed. What were the words poet Mary Oliver put in the eyes of her dog? Tell me you love me. Tell me again. I see those words in Freddie's eyes, and I saw them in Muggins too. Fast forward to spring 2019, I was living in Victoria again, and Sylvia reappeared at another book launch and signing I was holding at Bolin Books in Hillside Mall. Sylvia sat in the audience listening to me talk about my new book's topic, Woo, the Monkey Companion of artist Emily Carr, and the powerful effect animals have on human endeavors, always more crucial than we think or know. And afterward, she stood in line to get my inscription. Both of us had been through our different challenges over the course of the past several years, and we were relieved as pleased to see one another again. As I handed the book back to her, Sylvia said, "After tonight, I know it. There is no question. You are the one to write about Muggins. May I show you the material I've collected?" I was ready to tell Sylvia that yes, I very much wanted to see her collection. She came to tea at my house a week or so later. I helped her in with a number of bags she'd brought in her car. We emptied them of their contents in my living room, a mass of clippings, photographs, documents, everything else Sylvia and her researchers could find over the course of several years. She told me that far from being a comprehensive collection of material on Muggins, there were fundamental pieces of the puzzle still missing. Where was he born? Was his birthplace to be found in the well-appointed house of a Calgary millionaire? Had he been born in Russia, as it was also hinted? If he wasn't born here, how did he get to Victoria? And if he had been a rich man's pet, how did he so easily become a hardworking canvasser for public donations for the war effort? And there were many other questions that by rights should have been easily answered. What had happened to the portrait of him by a noted post-war battlefield artist? And what of the POWs who received Muggins' food packages through the Red Cross, men who were said to have written him letters thanking him for saving their lives? Had they survived? Had they started families? And what, Sylvia asked me, though really asked the universe, a question I was myself to direct to plenty of starry skies thereafter, what had become of Muggins' body, mounted and preserved, and later brought out to raise funds for the Red Cross during the Second World War? What is this little dog's legacy now, despite the ever-rolling river of historical amnesia which seems to follow every war? How shall we appreciate his life? I looked through the binders and folders and notepads, remembering Sylvia gazing into the distance over her teacup, as if the answers to all these mysteries lay not farther away, but closer, if we could just make them materialize. if we could just take an animal's devotion seriously.
Thank you for that introduction. And it certainly piques our interest in the character Muggins. Tell us more. Do you have another excerpt?
Actually, yes, I have when he first met the Prince of Wales in downtown Victoria. I can read a little bit of that, depending on how much time we have. It was on September 24th, 1919, and Muggins was brought to the legislature to meet the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, briefly, who was in town on a cross-Canada tour, but had been brought to Victoria specifically to lay the cornerstone for the Queen Victoria Memorial, she being his ancestress. So for his meeting with Prince Edward, Muggins wore his own customary uniform, consisting of a leather harness to which were attached 2 rectangular Fry's cocoa tins. These were sometimes covered in the Red Cross logo or those of other charities for which he was collecting, sometimes left to advertise their former contents. Beatrice Woodward, who was Muggins' guardian, would command him to stand still while she fitted the contraption over his head and body. Slots in the lids permitted donors to drop in coins and bills, and these they often did. These tourists visiting the city on the ships that constantly sailed across the Pacific or from across the Strait of Juan de Fuca. To such generous effect, Muggins often struggled to carry his clinking saddlebags back up Government Street to the Red Cross HQ on Fort Street. They were probably empty for today's event. Captured by a camera's lens, Muggins stands looking at as nervous as Edward, though, like the heir, this was hardly his first time as center of attention or as recipient of the applause of countless strangers. A young girl wearing white lace and ribbons, Doris Baker, niece of Beatrice, stepped forward, curtsied to the prince, and made a short speech about the wonder dog at their feet. She finished by offering the prince a photograph of Muggins. The prince accepted the photograph, saying, "You love Muggins, I love Muggins, Victoria and the whole empire love Muggins. I shall treasure this picture of this grand dog and keep it among my souvenirs at home in London." And then he went on to say, "Among the defenders of civilization may be reckoned some of the 4-footed creatures. Thanks, Muggins, thanks again and again, for to you, as well as other animal friends of man, is due a large portion of the empire's success. Muggins, in the name of empire, I salute you." And 3 months later, Muggins was gone. It was like his last turn in the sun, as it were. He came down with pneumonia, and in late December, early January, and passed away in mid-January. He was only 7 years old at that time.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
I don't know if you have a reading grant, or perhaps just tell a story from your writing about what a fundraising event might have looked like with Muggins.
So there are a variety of different ways that he was placed. There was a drugstore called Wilson's Drugstore down where I believe Burke's is now, where Muggins would be stationed either with his guardian, Beatrice Woodward, or with children who were his minders. And he was often associated with children. And in fact, from what I could tell, a lot of children participated in the fundraising efforts just so they could be with him or see him. Some children had never seen him before. They'd heard about him, and they just wanted to pet him. So he would be on a table, usually outside, and people would drop coins in his tins that he wore, or they would purchase tags and then wear those for tag days. It was on a tag day in August 1916 that Muggins first began in earnest raising funds, leading to an encounter with city council, asking Beatrice, well, why are you raising money? What is it for? Will you be selling alcohol next? It's kind of like the things that troubled people in 1916. And so the other place where he would raise funds was in Victoria, was on one of his 2 stands, actually 3 stands that he had in downtown, mainly around the Inner Harbor, between the legislature buildings, and the Empress Hotel. And the newsreel clip that we'll show later will show him on one of those stands, and how many people were attracted to him there, and obviously attracted enough to leave a donation. He raised the total, a modern equivalent, it's been estimated, of about $250,000. So he was, he won wins the prize of, the most successful fundraising animal, I guess, in Canadian history. But sometimes he was positioned in buildings. He would be in the Empress Hotel. There were times when he raised funds in Seattle. The Red Cross had a theater that that was set aside for people to come and see him and then make their donations. On that trip, he was actually hosted by the U.S. Military, who brought him back to Victoria on one of their ships. And during the trip back, the sailing back, awarded him a medal that would have made him an honorary lieutenant in the Foreign Service, which is one of the medals that are now in the Saanich archives. And then in Vancouver, he had an outdoor stand on a couple of occasions. It bothers one these days to think of a little dog sitting on a table in the cold. Oftentimes this was in January, February. But he had there was a fur rug, bearskin rug, and apparently he that was always there for him to keep warm. But I suggest in the book that his continued exposure to that kind of thing was ultimately not that good for him, and I think his guardian realized that too late. So he was a busy boy.
Well, very interesting events and a remarkable fundraising initiatives that he contributed to. We don't have any questions posted in the chat as yet. I invite any audience member to type a question in. We'd be happy to put it to Grant. And there are some. I'm getting a message now. There are some questions. Grant, can you see the questions on the?
Yes, I can. So I'm curious whether you found out more about Muggins' origins. I found out about as much as I think we ever will. Because he was an animal, he didn't leave any records behind. I wish they could write their memoirs, but they can't. So I was dependent on newspaper articles, and then I looked through a number of vital records dating back over a century. So basically, what I suggest and what I think is true is that Muggins was likely born in Langmore, which was the mansion in Calgary of a philanthropist named William Roper Hull, who founded Hull Services, which still provides assistance to people in need, families and children, which is very appropriate. He loved animals very much, and he and his wife had a number of these white Spitz dogs in their home. There are photographs in the book showing, and I found others that they were everywhere. And so from that point on, Muggins seems to have made his way into the hands of Mr. Hull's uncle, William J. Roper, who had the Cherry Creek Ranch near Kamloops. Now, he retired, sold that property, moved to Oak Bay, and lived in a lovely house there in his elder years. That's where Muggins would have been living when Mr. Roper died in 1916. Interestingly, I know he was in the hands of the Roper couple, Mr. and Mrs. Roper, because Mrs. Roper entered Muggins in a 1913 dog show in Victoria. And there's a picture of him looking very young, sort of what they call the puppy uglies that Pomeranians have. They look their ears are bigger than they should. They look bigger than they should. Freddie went through that period too. And then by 1916, he looks like the Muggins we know. And that, to me, that meant that was the same one. And a number of different connections. So that's basically, and then how he came into the ownership of or the guardianship of Beatrice Woodward is a bit of a mystery. But she belonged to a group called the IODE, the Daughters of Empire. And Mrs. Roper did as well, as did Mrs. Hull in Calgary. So I'm thinking Mrs. Hull in Calgary would hold IODE events at Langmore. And I'm thinking this was just really the only way these women of very disparate social backgrounds, because Beatrice was from a very working class background in England, and Mrs. Roper and Mrs. Hull were upper middle class ladies. I think that's how it happened. That just looks like that's how it happened. Dogs have a way of uniting people across social class lines, and all of these other silly divisions that we put up. And so, yeah, long answer to a short question.
Well, thank you for the question, Shoni, and for the answer, Grant. Do we have another question, Monica?
Yes. So, Grant, please tell us something about your research to determine some of the unanswered questions you mentioned in the introduction. There's a story that Muggins came from, Muggins and his mate, she's called Lulu, who was in Beatrice Woodward's guardianship before Muggins, which tells me that maybe Mrs. Roper was selling the dogs from their house in Oak Bay, is that they came from Russia. Now, these white Spitz dogs, these large white Pomeranians, were very, very popular in upper class households. There's never a picture of a Grand Duchess of Russia or the daughter of a financier without one of these little dogs sitting on her lap. And the Hulls in Calgary seem to have treated them much the same way. Easy to do when you live in a huge house with a lot of beautiful things. The pictures usually have them wearing pink ribbons around their necks and so on. And I think that's what Muggins came out of. He came out of a quiet household with elderly people who didn't move around much. He probably sat a lot. He was taken out for walks, probably by the maid. And then suddenly he's with Beatrice Woodward, and he's a working dog. Now, there's perhaps a tragic side to that too. Is this why he had such a short life? In all the photos I've seen, I've studied them over and over and over again of Muggins, and having a Spitz dog myself, and long experience of dogs, he looks like he's happy to be doing what he's doing. He doesn't look like he's being forced to do anything. I don't think Beatrice Woodward would have done that. She, sometimes oftentimes, dogs will do what they think pleases us, even when it's not to their benefit. You see this on the battlefields of Europe in World War I. Dogs that had no business being having their lives put at risk to win wars that they didn't cause, or any animal, being thrown out into a battlefield to run a message to the artillery, to train fire on a particular sector, and saving the lives of hundreds of men who may not have known that a little dog saved them. And so they keep doing what they think will please us, even if they don't feel like doing it. So there's that complication in Muggins' story. A lot of the some of the stories were that I found were contradictory. Others bore out in the record. But like I say, there's not. You have to go by what other people said, what they experienced. I found one very fortuitous account by a gentleman who later went on to become president of the American University in Beirut, who happened to be vacationing in Victoria during the war. And he was the one he's our source for Muggins, how Muggins fundraised aboard ships that came in. He would, Beatrice would let him loose on the ship. He'd run up, he would bark at people to get their attention. And then when he finished on deck, he would go below to the casino where all the older gentlemen were sitting around tables playing cards. And he would run around the table and run around the table over and over again to try to get their attention. If they ignored him, he would sit up and bark and keep barking. And if they kept ignoring him, he would jump on the table and sit on their cards. And that way they couldn't play anymore, and they had to put money. And of course, by that time they were so charmed, they would be stuffing dollar bills in his tins, which did not please him. Apparently, he wanted to hear the clinking of the coins. So Beatrice, in some interview she gave, she says that he's not happy, even though he brings back more money that way. He's not happy when he can't hear the coins in his. He doesn't think he's doing his job, because it's like his tins are empty, which is, a poignant little detail.
Well, smart fellow to attract that attention.
Yeah, for sure.
We have one more question, and then Grant will ask you to play that video and describe that rare video.
Yes. So, which part of Muggins' story were you most excited to research and find an answer to? I love that question, because my the part of the story I wanted to discover was where he came from. My dog, Freddie, we know very little about his beginnings, except that he was rescued from a puppy farm, as they say in the UK. And all we know is what we have, which is a dog that still has traumatic, still marked by the trauma of where he came from 11 years later. And I wondered how this little dog, who evidently was a pedigreed dog, who bore all the earmarks of having been very well cared for, and how was he able to do this thing? Running around the streets and meeting perfect strangers. Pomeranians don't really like meeting people they don't know. So how did this happen? And so just to get a hint of his extraordinarily unlikely background as a pampered pooch, really, and to find nothing about how he was trained to do any of these things, other than the fact he must have been very, very smart, and he picked up on things. And I think he loved Beatrice very, very much. You can tell in the pictures with them, and in this bit of newsreel that we have, he really adored her, as she did him.
Thank you for the question, and we'll let you go with the video.
It's charming, but I find it very moving, because there isn't much of an animal's life that's recorded that far back. you just don't see them moving. You have to. I've written, well, several books now where I've had to imagine an animal. I've had to look at their pictures a lot and read a lot about them and try to bring them back to life. And here he was. I found this clip in the middle of other newsreels from that period in Victoria, where soldiers marching down to the harbor to get on a ship to go abroad, coming back, and there he was. I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it. The famous dog Rags of the First Division, who I wrote about, mentioned earlier, he is referred to as having been filmed by newsreel cameras at least a dozen times, and I never found one anywhere. Never found moving film of him. And I've even seen stills obviously taken from newsreels. Never found the film. And then to see this little dog moving around, it was just unbelievable. And how sweet he was.
And that footage was just across from the Empress in the Inner Harbor?
Yes, it was at the corner of Government and Belleville. So just kitty corner from where the Emily Carr statue is right now, at that particular entrance to the Empress Hotel grounds. He was frequently at the Empress, so it was his stomping ground down there.
Can you play it one more time? That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. It's that of course is the legislative buildings behind him. It doesn't change that much. The World War I memorial wasn't there at that time. A funny story. Speaking of finding the origins of stories about Muggins, a story went around that Muggins his remains were to be buried under that monument, but I don't think that happened. He was also meant to be put. There was at one time a natural history museum in the legislature building, and Muggins was said to be slated for a spot after his death, when he was taxidermied, but that never happened either. So yeah, it's a lot of stories. The press at the time thrived on not very well sourced material. So sounds familiar, doesn't it? Anyway, but yeah.
Monica, do we have another question?
Did the city have a ceremony to memorialize Muggins' service at the time of his death? No, they didn't. It was considered, people were so gutted by this that, there were letters to the time, that what is now the Times Colonist. One young woman said that she woke up to the news and she thought, if only I could trade my little cat, whose name is also Muggins, to bring Muggins back to life, I would do that. People were completely broken up by his death. It was so unexpected, and it also had a really seriously sad effect on Beatrice Woodward and her husband. I don't know, like I've said, whether she blamed herself for his death. He had just had a busy schedule. He'd been to a Christmas event that December of 1919. He had been at the Empress. He'd done late night things with her. His last Christmas was spent out at the Esquimalt Military Hospital with the men, but it went really late and it was very cold. Whatever it was, she was not able to actually live in Victoria anymore. She and her husband moved to Vancouver shortly after this, and then they moved to LA. and that's where they died. She came back to Victoria once to give some memorabilia of Muggins, and to formally give his the mounted body, which was done shortly after his death, to give that to a veterans association. But that mounted body is actually referenced in the title of the book. That's The Afterlife of Muggins, because not even a year after the body was placed, looked very lifelike when it was new, was placed in a glass box and was used for fundraising for Red Cross events. And children were, of course, drawn to this. And then during World War II, he was placed in his box in a window of a Red Cross superfluities store, thrift store downtown. And more money was raised, so he was still raising funds for war-related charities. What's sad is that he was the body, the figure was exposed to the elements and people touching it all the time. And I was telling somebody the other day, if you know what a fur coat looks like, that hasn't been taken care of, or has been left out in the heat, it got all very dry and brittle, and the hair fell off. And the last that is known of Muggins was a piece of white hair that was taken from that figure. That was all that was left, and that was held by the family of Beatrice Woodward that remained in Victoria, and then that disappeared. So there's nothing, and we don't even know where the body of Muggins was buried. It may have been buried in the house, near the house where he died on Gorge Road West, but short of an archaeological dig, I don't know that we would find that. That's why I felt like the book would be his memorial of a kind.
Absolutely. Great questions this evening, everyone. Is there another question, Monica? And perhaps Grant could then go to a couple of photographs from the book.
Have you discovered any more information about the Ritter painting? Mary Ryder Hamilton was a wonderful unsung, but she's becoming better known now, war artist who was she tasked herself really with going to the battlefields after the war, battlefields of France after the war, before everything was prettified and flowers planted everywhere, and when it was still a landscape from hell. And there were graves everywhere, and she painted landscapes of these and various views of this hellscape. And these paintings we're only now are we, as we do with Emily Carr's paintings, are we seeing just what a genius the artist was. She painted a portrait of Muggins, Mary Ryder Hamilton, that I think she must have seen him from her studio on Fort Street as he was running up with his saddlebags full of coins. And so she painted a portrait of him sitting on his stand as in front of the Empress. And it was raffled off, or said to be raffled off, to benefit the Red Cross. And it has disappeared. Nobody knows where it is. However, an individual, a lady in England, who inherited a portrait of Muggins from her mother, came forward with it recently, and it was painted from life. And it was painted during his lifetime, because the date of of armistice was not even painted in, just the beginning date of the war. And so that portrait, thanks to her permission, her kind permission, is reproduced in the book. But we don't know what happened to the other one. Very strange. It should be really obvious. A white dog sitting on a table with a pot of violets beside him. So anybody, you see that, if it's hanging in your house or somewhere, just let us know.
Here we go. Okay, we'll give you a few minutes, Grant, if you have some of the photographs that you want to touch on.
Sure. So this is a postcard from my collection. It's Muggins Obviously, he's wearing his tins. He's standing on the red ensign. He's got the Union Jack behind him. He had collected over $3,000 by that time. They had to change this stamp frequently because he kept making so much more money. These were given to people who donated, and I bought it through a rare book dealer in the U.S., oddly enough, and it's a treasure of my collection. I collect books about animals in war and animals who've been conscripted to the uses of war, and this is a little treasure. We have it on our mantelpiece. Next. This is Langmore. This is the mansion of the Hull family in Calgary. It's no longer there. It is where Muggins probably was born, and from which he was brought to Kamloops and then to Oak Bay by means that I can only guess at, but that's where the trail led me. Next, please. This is Muggins sitting on his table. And this is probably pretty much the view that Mary Ryder Hamilton would have painted, where he's sitting there, and instead of a Red Cross donation box, he would have had a bunch of violets next to him. And you can see that by this time he's made something like $20,000. So this is probably 1918, could be 1919. This is he went on one occasion when he was sitting on this table at the Empress. He jumped down, and the local dog catcher caught him and put him in his truck. This led to a massive reaction from everyone on the street. They came running over, ordered the man to stop what he was doing. Beatrice was there. She couldn't get him to stop. She called the mayor, who wasn't very helpful. I have to say there were council members who were absolutely horrified that this had happened. And the mayor, when he got the full picture, it was like, oh my God. I mean, this is our our city treasure here, this little dog. Eventually, a couple of returned veterans came over and offered to rearrange the dog napper's face if he didn't put the dog down. And finally, the police came, and the man was then compelled to put Muggins back down. Led to a big scandal. There were letters to the paper, people saying, that there should be all kinds of changes to bylaws, and so that this never happened again. The irony is that there were many dogs wandering around who were basically strays, and here's this dog that has been so hardworking, and this is the one the dog napper picks. Anyway, next, please. This is Muggins aboard a ship full of soldiers who are going off to war. This is in the inner harbor. That's the Empress in the background, and that is Muggins, a little white fluff there that you can see, being held by the Reverend Arthur Owen, one of the wonderful personalities of early Victoria, early 20th century Victoria, a real saint and a man who had a hilarious sense of humor. He did it so much for so many people, for children. He would basically for I think most of the years of his life as a father, he spent Christmas morning with the sick children at Royal Jubilee, giving out presents as Santa, and then he went home to his own family. It's the kind of man he was. So he and Muggins were a team, and there he is holding him. And you can see some of the soldiers looking at Muggins quite lovingly. Next, please. This is Muggins out at Esquimalt Military Hospital, where he frequently visited the men. He was much loved. There are also photographs of him with the nurses who loved playing with him. He was basically an early comfort dog, a therapy dog. This was long before we had that concept of a working dog who was there to comfort people and to console and to calm people down. But he did it. He just knew how to do it. And the men loved him. You can see they just there are many photos. I couldn't use them all. Next, please. So this is Muggins on the front steps of the original entrance to the Empress Hotel with General Sir Arthur Currie, who Mark Zuelke points out in the foreword had as many medals as Muggins did. Muggins had 8 medals in total, and they're all now at the Saanich archives. I've gone and I've held them. It's a very special experience. Is there another one? Another photo? Yes, this is Muggins with the Prince of Wales. That's Doris Baker, Beatrice Woodward's niece, handing the Prince of Wales the photograph with various dignitaries around. That's the plinth behind them. You can barely see it. Says the cornerstone laid on this day, September 24th, 1919. That's what the Queen Victoria statue stands on now, facing the other way. So that's the harbor behind them. Muggins, this is just before the prince gave his speech to Muggins, extolling him. And I contacted the Windsor Castle Archives and various other sources that I thought might have the photograph. But what I gather is that when the then Edward VIII abdicated in favor of the woman he loved, his life was blown to smithereens, and a lot of his things just didn't make their way across the channel to France. And I mean, how many pictures did he have of people? And so who knows what happened to the photograph, but it's lovely that he said he would keep it and put it up on his wall of his study in London. I think is there another picture? Yes, these are his medals. These are 7 of them. We don't know where the 8th is. The one in the center, it was actually specially made. It's a little carved figure, bas-relief figure showing what Muggins looked like, and that arrived after his death. Most sadly, it came in the post after he had died. So that must have been a very sad day for Beatrice. These were given to the Saanich archives by Jean Hughes, who is Doris Baker's descendant. Yeah, that's wonderful to see them. The bar with the little American flag, that was a bit of a mystery. People didn't know what that was, but it was actually that's what he was given by the Americans, and it's a lieutenant's bar. It's meant to be worn upright vertically, but in order to put his name on a little banner underneath and to solder a little American flag on it, they turned it sideways. At one point toward the end of his life, he wore most of these on his harness. So I think that's it.
Well, thank you, Grant. And time has flown by this evening.
Yes.
I'll just turn to Monica if there's a last question before. Okay, I'm not sure. Oh, there we go.
Oh, yes. Paul Jenkins of the Red Cross, who was instrumental in, along with Sylvia Van Kirk, in making a lot of this happen for me. Also, congratulations from the Canadian Red Cross. The book launch was put on our blog today. Really enjoyed working with you, Grant, as I did with you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
And I'm donating the author royalty, all of my royalties to the BCSPCA for all the work they do, as well as for enabling us to have Freddie as part of our lives, and the Red Cross BC Yukon. So
that's great. Well, Grant, it's been a pleasure to do this with you this evening. Your passion, your remarkable research has produced a very fascinating story. I didn't finish reading the book. I thought listening to you speak this evening would actually make it more meaningful. Reading the last half of the book, so thank you. I'm very keen to continue reading it. I've read 3 of your previous books, and again, Grant does remarkable research in bringing characters to life and finding the really interesting parts of their of the background and how the story came together. And the book is very readable and telling the story of Muggins, and we're so glad you did. And
Thank you.
I think back to that day, Remembrance Day in Tanner's, when the spark was first ignited for this.
Yes, I think of it often. And the the strange pathway that led me back to Sydney and to for the book to be. It was meant to be.
So we do have lots of copies of Grant's book at Tanner's Books in Sydney, and we are happy. We're open from 9 till 5, 7 days a week. If you would like to have it personally inscribed to yourself, or you're thinking of a person to give it to as a gift, and you'd like to have a personal message to that person, please email service@tannersbooks.com. There we are, up on the screen, by October 24th, this Sunday. And Grant will then come in and do that. You can then pick your copy up at the store. It'll be reserved under your name, or we would be happy to ship it to you wherever you might be. And with that, Grant, just want to thank you again for a very pleasurable evening.
Thank
very
you.
Interesting story. Thank you to the
My
audience
pleasure.
members. Thank you to the audience members for joining us and great questions. And Monica, we couldn't have done tonight without yourself and the setup on this platform. Thank you very much for all of that. And with that, I'll say good evening to all.
Thanks very much, everybody.